Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Colin's Last Stand right here on YouTube. My name is Colin Moriarty, but I'm somewhere mysterious. Well, it's not very mysterious because there are so many Rubin Report fans out there in the world and fans of Colin's Last Stand that watch Rubin Report and have seen me on Rubin Report. And David and Amir have allowed me to use their studio to do a very special interview that a lot of you guys have been requesting lately. And that interview is with my father, Gerry Moriarty, retired FDNY Lieutenant Gerard Moriarty. So, Dad, thank you for joining me on Dave Rubin's set.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dave Rubin, for allowing this to happen.
Yeah, we really appreciate them, and obviously you should go check that stuff out if you haven't already seen it. But Dad, this has been a long time coming. Back when I was at Kind of Funny even, we had talked about having you on to do an interview specifically about your experiences on 9/11. And well, now that I do a channel on history and politics, it seems like it makes quite a bit of sense that we do it in the political realm as well. So are you excited? Are you a little nervous? How do you feel?
I'm excited, I'm nervous, and I think, depending on, considering the date that we're actually doing this, I think it's the time. This is the time to do it.
Yep, it's weird because you and I had talked. I went to see you and Dagan, your son, my brother, out east on Long Island, and it was very serendipitous because we had talked about having you, and then I realized that actually a Monday was 9/11, that 9/11 was falling on a Monday, which is typically when I publish, and you were able to make this work right after Labor Day because we're recording it the weekend, or the Friday before that 9/11. So thank you for coming out and all of that as well.
Thank you.
So Dad, I think the best way to introduce this is to kind of give a little bit of background on who you are and kind of how you found your way into the fire department to begin with, and then I think we should segue into what happened that day. And I think really one of the most essential parts of your story is what happened in the days, months, and years afterwards, and how you stayed engaged and actually became a pretty big player with people that had survived and had been there, and kind of helping them out. So does that sound like a good place to start with you?
Sure.
So we were talking about this actually when we were in Montauk, but how did you find your way into the fire department?
I was an iron worker, and one of my friends, Dennis, we were working, at the time, we were bouncing back and forth between working in the city and on Long Island, and we were actually working on the University of Old Westbury. And Dennis said to me, hey, I'm taking the fire department test. Do you want me to get you an application?
And this was what year?
This was 1970. And so I said, sure. And Dennis got me the application. I took the test in '71, and as they say, the rest is history. I was hired. I got on the job. I had to go for a special medical because when I was with an uncle and one of your uncles, and we were up in Connecticut cliff diving, and I fractured my back. And so I was afraid that I wasn't going to get on the fire department. And they put me through a whole special medical, and they said, yeah, you're fine. And so then they hired me, but at that time there was a lot of challenges with the hiring and quota systems and stuff like that. So I was actually hired, and then they told me, never mind. And so I wasn't hired till 1977.
So it was literally a 7-year process.
Yeah.
And so you were 20 years old when you were in 1970, 21 depending on what time of the year it was. You were just out of the Air Force at that time.
Yep.
You were in there for a couple of years. So this happens, you're an iron worker. 1977 rolls around, the year that Star Wars: A New Hope came out, by the way.
Yes.
And so you become a fireman. So where were you a fireman? Because I think this is actually essential to the story as well, specifically where you ended up in the firehouse you ended up in. But also, tell me a little bit about that experience of being a fireman.
Well, I was assigned, of course, not knowing anybody and not realizing until years later that several of my friends they were firemen working in the Bronx and other areas, but unbeknownst to me. And so I wound up in East New York, in Brooklyn, a ladder company 175, which was what we call a truck company with, kind of like the Little Rascals, the guy riding in the back of the fire truck. So we were a very busy company, and it was a very busy fire area. And we, that was the start of my career working there. I worked with a lot of seasoned firefighters at the time, and I got assigned. I was 26, actually turned 27 actually when I got there. So I wasn't quote unquote a 21-year-old probie. I was a kid. I was an iron worker. I had, so I was treated with a little more deference, and through time and exposure and training, I was trained by some of the most talented, bravest, dedicated firefighters in that whole area, in Brooklyn, in East New York, Bed-Stuy, Brownsville, Bushwick. That's where I primarily worked, and there was a best bunch of guys I've ever worked with.
And we'll talk about it in a little while, but the specifically ending up in East New York and in Brooklyn is important to the story a little bit later because of the nature of that location towards Lower Manhattan, where everything goes down. So we'll get to that in a minute. But specifically, East New York, pretty ungentrifiable part of a gentrifying Brooklyn, but back then even worse. So this is kind of, for lack of a better term and pardon the pun, kind of a trial by fire as well for you, right? Because it's kind of it's a rough part of New York City. Like you said, it's very active with fires, but you get a lot of good experience, like you were saying there.
Yes, and that's really, it's OJT, it's all on-the-job training. What you learned in the academy and did all that stuff, it's like, yeah, okay, this is really how we do it, this is how you do it. And yeah, there was a lot of senior guys, a lot of mentoring, and you basically did it. It was just rote. The more you did it, the better you became.
And yeah, I remember going into the firehouse with you. I remember it very well. Several times, I remember how heavy your helmet was. And you put it on my head, and I can barely stand up. Your boots, I can like swim in them. And don't know if we should be admitting this, but you brought me on to a fire once too, which was pretty cool. So, although it ended, you brought me into the truck with you to this fire, but it ended up being a false alarm, which probably happened pretty often. Right. So I remember being a little disappointed, but in hindsight, I was like disappointed that something wasn't scorching to the ground.
Right.
But a pretty cool experience. So it was very, it was cool to grow up with a dad that was a New York City firefighter. But it really wasn't until the 90s when I realized, I guess as I was becoming more cognizant, I'm sure my brother and my sisters who are all older than me realized it sooner, that it's a dangerous job and that you could get seriously hurt. And you were seriously hurt in the 90s, and this is also a very important piece to the story that we're going to tell. Mm-hmm. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, part of the dynamic is a lot of guys worked hurt because we had to, because you couldn't, we had unlimited medical leave if you were injured, but you couldn't work, you were not allowed to work, and all of us basically worked side jobs in order to support and take care of our families because we weren't highly paid at the time. And so a lot of guys worked, with injuries and hurt. And I had gotten hurt at a job, and subsequently it was just, that was the end of it. I had to go. I got evaluated, and I had several operations on my hands and my wrists.
You fell in a fire.
I fell. Yeah. It was actually. It was a fire where we were running. I had the outside vent. An outside vent is you take you take a 20-foot straight ladder and you run with it, and you get to the rear of wherever the fire is, and you go up and you go to try to vent the opposite way that the engine company is coming in, and you also go in to try to search as well. And so when I was doing that, I was running. Was sizing up the building, and I had this 20-foot straight ladder on my shoulder carrying my other tools, and there was a hole, I didn't see it, and I went down, the ladder came down on me, I broke the fall with my hands to the best I could, got up, continued doing what I was doing for the job. When the job was over, they took me to the hospital, and it was like no time lost. And, but at that point, that's where I had like the compression injuries, and that's where I was losing the feeling in my hands and my fingers, and if you remember, my hands were always bleeding.
Yep, I remember you
I constantly had duct tape
and
I had duct tape on every finger because they would bleed and crack. And
yeah, you had a ton of surgeries. I don't think I realized at the time how very serious it was, how traumatic that was physically for you. But that caused you to be you were put on light duty, right? And then ended up actually retiring.
Retired, right.
And this is where the story, I think, gets really dynamic, because by all rights, you shouldn't have been there that day. You shouldn't, like, you had a reason to be there, but you had no duty, I guess, to be there. You were on the island by the time 2001 came around. You were retired, and due to injury, and yet you find yourself there that day. But before I get into what happened that day, because we're obviously that's going to be the meat of the interview, was there any specific terrorist training that you guys received as a fire department, specifically after 1993 with the bombing at the Trade Center? In other words, where was everyone's minds the day before 9/11? Was there a preparedness for something like this to have happened, or is this an eventuality that was unthinkable?
I think it was talked about, but the 93 bombing, I don't think they, obviously they knew it for what it was. But as far as the, actual terrorist training on, being aware of, again, there was no frame of reference other than that. So it was just like a random, they viewed it as a random incident. And there were other mitigating factors going on, and it was more dealing with, the drug culture was really big, and, they were trying to work on, there was phenomenon working with wind-driven fire at the time because, the different effects of fighting fires in high-rise buildings and high-rise apartments, close to water, the wind-driven effect, they call it. And so there was a lot of emphasis on that, but on terrorist stuff per se, no.
Okay. And so this brings, I think it sets a nice foundation for us to get to 9/11. So September 11, 2001, I'm a senior in high school. You are in college at the time.
I'm finishing up graduate school.
You're finishing up grad school, and everything goes down. So what is bring me through the day. Bring me through, not the day, but bring me through the morning. You wake up, this is already probably going down at that time. Maybe.
Yeah, it was, the routine that we had, get you up, get you off to school. I'm home making coffee. Your brother calls me, and he says, turn on the television. Now, as a rule, I don't really watch television.
Right. My dad actually has a sticker on the that's been on the fridge for decades that says "Kill your television." So yeah.
So he says, put on the television. So I put the TV on, and I see the plane hitting the World Trade Center, and then I'm listening to the news, and I'm like, holy cow. So I start making phone calls. I called my company, I couldn't get them, I called the battalion, I called the division, I called all these different numbers trying to figure out what's going on, what's happening. And I wasn't really able to get anybody. And so at that point, I went and I grabbed my gear. I still had my helmet, my boots, my coat. So I grabbed what I could. I changed. I put a shirt, a Bradford Street shirt on, and I scrawled a quick note to you that, and I have to step back a little bit. I think I finally did get somebody at Bradford Street, and they told me that Tommy and Harry, and they started rattling off a bunch of guys, are missing. And these are all guys that I knew and worked with.
Tommy Kavekis is your best friend.
Tommy, yeah, yep. And Harry Davis and Cliffy Hollywood, and they were in different companies, but we all worked together. And so there was all this concern that a lot of these guys were missing. And I didn't really have all the information about what ultimately had happened. So I just wrote you a note, and I said, Colin, I'm going to look for Tommy. And jumped in my car, jumped on the expressway, was doing like 90 in the HOV lane, and the cop pulled me. I remember a Suffolk cop pulled me over, and I was like incensed. And I got out like, what are you doing? And he saw the shirt, and he just gave me a wave. I took off. I drove all the way down, from Eastern Long Island into Brooklyn, and trying to get information from the guys. I remember I had the ladder companies with artillery. They have a ladder pipe on it, and it's a spool with rope on it with little halyards on it, and that controls that you do it from the ground. So I grabbed that, and I grabbed a pike axe, was what the chauffeur used, just trying to get tools to go. And they were staging over at the division, which was over in Brownsville. So we headed over to the division, and everybody's meandering around. Now, you have to understand from a managerial perspective, you have thousands of firefighters. There was a mass recall. So everybody on the job was called back in. So you have all these guys, everybody's worrying about, getting in there to help their buddies, help their friends. All the people that, again, the civilian that were trapped, and so they just want to go to work. So there was this mass push for everybody to get in there. And so the fire department was trying to manage that the best they could. So we're standing there in front of the division, and ultimately I looked, and one of the guys, we knew each other. I hadn't seen him in a while. We kind of gave each other the heads up. And I walked out onto Howard Avenue, and I just walked, and there was a city bus coming down the block, and I stopped the bus, and I just said, what, commandeering your bus? And the driver said, okay, asked the people to get off. And then there was 15, maybe 18 of us got on the bus, and he drove us in over the bridge into Manhattan, Lower Manhattan.
So it's an extraordinary, so I remember you telling me that, that came out later, that you guys had literally commandeered a city bus to get over the bridge because of the heinousness of it. But it was the proximity of that bridge to certain bridges, I guess, to certain firehouses that devastated certain firehouses worse than others. So Brooklyn firehouses, Lower Manhattan firehouses were, in many cases, wiped out.
Yep.
Because they got there first,
right,
as opposed to firehouses in Queens or in Staten Island or whatever that might have taken a little bit more time
right.
to.
And a lot of them were going over the bridges, the Brooklyn bridges. A lot of them were coming through the tunnel, but there was a secondary effect where there was a bomb threat, and so there was a time when they were staging at the tunnels, and they were told to stand by because they were afraid that they were going to blow up the Midtown Tunnel. And so there was a little delay in that, and a couple of the individuals said, yeah, screw it, and they went anyway. So yeah, there was a mass push to get into the city in whatever way, and there was, as you know, New York City, from there it's the 59th Street Bridge, it's the Midtown Tunnel, depending on where you are, if you're going to go into the Williamsburg or you're going to go down to the Manhattan Bridge or the Brooklyn Bridge. Those are the only ways in.
Right.
So companies did do that, because again, everybody wanted to be there to help to do what they could do. So there was a mass push from that part of Brooklyn, which would have been the west side of Brooklyn.
So what was the feeling? You guys had said that there was an eagerness to get into the city, or to get off the staging areas into Manhattan, and to kind of coalesce around that area. But what was the feeling? What were the feelings that were being felt there? Was it anger? Was there fear? Was there, obviously there was an eagerness, but what do you remember the palpable nature of how everyone felt at that time?
I think, as a firefighter, first responder, when you're going to work, when you know you have a job, you just get into that mindset. So you just get fixated. Physiologically, everything pulls. The adrenaline, everything goes to your body because it's almost that fight or flight. So you're going into that fight mode, and that's really all you're experiencing. So everybody was pretty much in that vein. And I think I had mentioned to you and your brother, going over the bridge, the reality of the situation when you see an Army half-track there and a guy's on the back of it with a .50 caliber machine gun as you're going over the bridge. And it was like, holy cow, You know, the magnitude of the event, and the fighter planes flying overhead. So it was so mass and vast that hard to take it all in all at once, you know. And of course, then we got there, and then you start to see the devastation.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about that. You get into Manhattan. What do you see? Like, what are you seeing on the ground there? Because obviously the footage that a lot of us had experienced because we were not there, it obviously seemed horrifying, and I assume it was 20,000 times worse than it being there in person.
Well, it was, all you saw was everything was white. It was like this pulverized dust, and it was, you know, at 8 inches, 6 inches, 12 inches thick, and it was everywhere. And you just saw mass destruction. And I just remember we walked through, and that would have been the plaza area where the big dome was. And then there was the pile that everybody kind of knows with the remnants of of one of the walls standing up. And to the north of that, it was that was like the high point of the site. And then you went to the north, and it was you know. It went down almost into like a vast hole pit. And you could see all the ancillary buildings around, the American Express building, and all those buildings were on the river. So, and you know, the remnants of the hotel, and you know, there was fires burning, and other buildings had collapsed. So it was too much to kind of take it all. You knew it was all there, you could see it, but for you to process it, it was just too vast, you know.
Yeah, it seems akin in a way to like a war scene you'd see on TV from a random place in the Middle East or something, Syria or something like that. It almost seemed like from the outside, it almost seemed to me to be, and I think it was heightened probably by what you were saying with the military and the Air Force being on the scene of being quite a scary thing. But did you have any notion at that time, I never actually asked you this even in private, but did you ever have a notion at that time or any interest in who did it? Because I remember that no one really knew for a little while. I remember being in high school, they actually didn't let us out, I just left that day. But I remember the speculation was running rampant on who did it or whatever. So did you guys, was that even relevant in your mind at that time? You didn't even think about like who was responsible and how they coordinated something like this?
Didn't even enter, didn't even think about it.
And did you hear anything about what happened at the Pentagon and what happened at that time? Did you know that it was even faster than what happened in New York, that there was in Washington and Pennsylvania?
I think maybe later on that afternoon. I mean, everybody was kind of fixated and trying to, take it in and to try to be as effective as we could be. There were fires burning. There were things happening. Things were going on. One of the guys that I knew came up to me. I actually was with, and I'm trying to think, I'm pretty sure that was the first day that he came up to me and this friend of mine, Tommy Greeny, who sadly Tommy died from World Trade Center illnesses after that, a couple of years later. He'd said, there's something burning. He was a battalion chief, and his name was Richie Bourbon. And he came up to us and he said, do me a favor, there's something burning, because there was a mall area below. And he said, he said, do me a favor, go check it out. So me and Tommy went, and it was actually what it wound up being was a woman, there was some type of a woman's clothing store, and the mall was intact. I mean, there was not, everything, if you left and the glasses of water on the table, they were still there. So nothing was really out of place, and we're looking, and we went in, and there was a storage area in the back of the store that went up to the second floor, and that was roaring. That was on fire. That's what was burning. So we got a line to put that fire out, and there were all incidents like that, with remnants of buildings on fire, car fires. The area was really stressed from a firematic perspective, so they had to start drafting from the rivers. So they were using fireboat and satellites and stuff like that just to get water to put out the fires. And everybody was kind of involved in their own things, whether they were doing surface recovery, trying to mitigate to sea, if they could rescue anybody, and that's essentially what everybody was doing. And as the days progressed, it became more refined and more organized. Because initially it was not pandemonium, but it was not, everybody was, doing their own thing, trying to rescue or mitigate whatever was going on.
Yeah, I guess that kind of gets to the question I had, which was, it seemed like there was some order there, because it did seem like pandemonium to me, or you would imagine that would be pandemonium with no leadership structure that was prepared for this kind of attack, which is why I asked the question about after the '93 World Trade Center bombing, if there was like some sort of protocol. But this attack seems so above and beyond, as you had insinuated. It's almost like an attack on the United States itself, like a military thing. Yeah. So bring me through the rest of that day. So you're there, bus goes over, you put out this fire at this woman's, in that mall. How does the day progress, and how do you find your way that first day back to the island? Because I don't even really remember. I remember from my perspective, to give people some perspective, we didn't know where the hell you were. We assumed that you were probably fine, but you never really know, because when you start putting the pieces together, you realize that you couldn't have possibly gotten into the city in time for the buildings to have collapsed. So you probably survived, but you also kind of put together the pieces that Bradford Street was probably largely affected by it, and along with other fire departments and stuff like that. But I remember Dagan was there. Allie, our sister, your daughter, my sister, came home. She was on the island. I think Mom drove down from Boston. But what do you remember about how that day progressed? Because that's kind of a dark spot for me.
We just were doing, from that point forward, we were just trying to do surface recovery and looking to see how we could be effective in really doing search and recovery. And I think the problem was very evident initially, after doing some minimal surface recovery, realizing that it was just a pile of steel and a twisted steel and stone. And so there was no way it would be like, okay, try to dig a hole in the floor there, with a plastic bucket. You can't do it.
Right.
So early on, and I kind of knew it in the back of my head, having worked on that building when it was going up in 1969.
That's the ironic part, right? Is that you actually worked on putting the towers up.
Yes, they were. When I worked, those were the first jobs I worked on. 1969, May of '69, I worked on that, on Tower. They called it Tower A and Tower B. Tower A, I think we went up 44 stories, and then there was a huge strike, and Tower B was up out of the ground. I don't remember how many, not that much. And so we worked on that, and there was a strike, so the job shut down. And when we went back to work after the strike, I went over to 23rd Street on the East River. So I never went back to the World Trade Center. But I knew when I worked on that there was 10 floors below, and so you couldn't bring in a conventional crane, because they would collapse into the debris. So they had to use smaller pieces of equipment to manage it, and which is ultimately what they did to do the recovery, and to try to get the site cleaned up, and to rescue the people, and to recover the people who had perished on that day. And in essence, that's what they did until June of 2002. And so so the rest of that day, we were just trying to do what we could do, and there was a high degree of frustration because we felt so powerless. The tools that we had, the various torches and saws and different things, were good for a minimal amount, but we realized that we needed even bigger stuff. And ironically, on I think the 12th or the 13th, I was working and I ran into three of the brothers. They were the younger brothers, Johnny Small, Chris, we used to call his brother Chris Gorey, his brother, and another fella. They were the younger brothers of guys that I worked with on that site. And so they were now iron workers, and they came down to volunteer their help, and there was a bunch of their friends. So it was really, the iron workers were an integral part of doing the ultimately recovery and restoration of that site. And we wouldn't have been able to do it without them.
So, out of respect, we did talk about, we're not going to get too deep into the details of the kind of the terrible things that you had seen. Some pretty heinous stuff that was obviously the death and destruction. We're talking, I think, in abstracts about buildings, about saws cutting metal, about all these kinds of things, but obviously there are fatalities everywhere.
There's a tremendous loss of life, very sad, very sad. And I would have to say that in the realm of the fire department, it was about bringing the brothers home, finding their remains, and giving their families some solace that they were able to bury their loved ones. Unfortunately, for many of those people, and I don't know what the exact numbers are now, but it was probably, we lost 343 firefighters that day, and there was, many who were never recovered, Tommy being one of them. Of the 3,000 people who almost died that day, the civilians, also, civilians, police, restaurant workers, Cantor Fitzgerald people. So a lot of those people were not recovered. They just were not recovered. So everyone was dealing with this mass loss of life. And again, short of being in a war, we really didn't have any experience. We were kind of learning as we went along. And trying to be as respectful as everyone could possibly be. And which, I do know the fire department certainly did do that. And they did that as well with civilian personnel as well. If they could identify somebody, because a lot of times you would find a piece of gear or equipment and you would have an indication of who it is. But everybody was taken out with that same care and reverence regardless of. And then they had a morgue right on the site, and they would bring it there, and then they would subsequently be able to identify and notify the families and so forth.
What was the toll? Obviously, 343 is a number that's famous to 9/11, or people in New York and people that know all about it, indicating the amount of firefighters, as you said, that had died. What was the toll specifically on people you knew, and what was the toll specifically on your firehouse? Because I think this brings us back to the point of why I want to talk about you getting hurt in the 90s. Specifically that if you weren't hurt in the 90s, there's a decent chance you would have died.
Well, there were a lot of guys in my house that I worked with. The exact number from Bradford Street, I think, is around 12 or 13 guys.
So pretty much everyone that was on duty at the time.
They were not on duty that day. They were working in their own respective firehouses. They all came through Bradford Street.
Okay.
They all worked there, and whether it was Larry Stack or Donald Burns or Tommy Haskell, Tommy Kavekis, Bobby Nagel, there was a lot of people who they either worked in the engine or the truck at one point in their careers, and now they were in other careers, other avenues. Larry was in the safety battalion. Bobby Nagel was up in 58. Tommy Haskell was in 132. So there was a lot of different guys. I worked with Jack Fanning. Jack Fanning was in hazmat. John Chrissy was in hazmat. And I'm just trying to think off of the top of my head. There was a lot of guys. And so there was a tremendous loss of life with guys that I knew intimately, guys that I knew very well, and then guys that I knew, where, sometimes you'd work in a adjoining company and you knew each other. Hey, how you doing? How's your kids? Blah, blah, blah. There was a lot of loss, and not just for me, but for everyone. And the 343 was the, original number for firefighters, and then it was the police and EMS and Port Authority Police, New York City Police. But our numbers now have gone up to, and these numbers are off, they're moderate. We're up to another 157 guys have died.
From respiratory illness and all
From
this?
World Trade Center illness. We have right now probably 1,500, and again, my numbers I think are soft. We have 1,500 guys with cancer that they're treating related to 9/11. And yesterday, I mentioned Harry Davis. Well, Harry Davis died last year. Tommy Greene died a couple of years ago. Tony Nuccio was another one. I'm sorry, Tony survived one 9/11 cancer and then had another one, and he died. So there are a lot of guys who have died since from the World Trade Center cancers, which, through the Zadroga bill, which came from James Zadroga, who was a New York City detective, and through the persistence of his father and his family and different senators and congressmen, they were able to pass the Zadroga bill, which gave us a first form of treatment, and the World Trade Center Health Program was started, which has been a blessing for us to get treatment, because so many guys were retired after 9/11, and they've come down with these respiratory illnesses, sinuses, cancers, different autoimmune diseases and so forth. So it's been a godsend for us in our community, and not only for the firefighters, but and the first responders, police, but also the civilian personnel, the construction personnel. John Field was involved with the Field Foundation, the Feel Good Foundation. John Stewart was very much involved with, Ray Pfeiffer just died a couple of months ago. Ray Pfeiffer was in 35 and 40. He would lobby and go to Washington to try to really alert everybody how important it was to continue for the care and treatment and monitoring of people who worked on 9/11. Dr. John Howard is the administrator for the World Trade Center Health Program, which covers the fire department, Mount Sinai, and Stony Brook. There's 3 different entities that you can go to. They call them centers of excellence. And we have, in the fire, we have David Prezant, we have Dr. Kerry Kelly, who have been unbelievably supportive and proactive for the care and treatment of the firefighters, the retirees, and so forth. And you have dedicated people in there. Dr. Jeff Lowe, who's like just an unbelievable man, and everybody that's involved with it. Malachi Corrigan, when the 9/11 happened, the fire department didn't have a counseling unit per se. And now all of a sudden they had this massive need to create or have an entity where guys could go and talk because of their experiences. And the whole onset of post-traumatic stress disorder became a very real factor for the job, along with dealing with the massive loss, the massive health consequences, but there was also the massive psychological impact on a force that still had to provide coverage for a tremendous city.
Right. In other words, it's not like the war is over. You did your duty. You have to go back, and
Right.
and there's going to be an influx of new people that are going to need to be trained and mentored and all that as well.
Correct. And so that was the onset of the counseling unit, and then Frank Lito, and other individuals, Frank and Ralph Esposito and other individuals, they created a peer program where they created a network where a peer, another firefighter, could go into a firehouse to kind of break down that wall of silence, to kind of steer those individuals who may need help to get counseling, whether it was through the fire department or through outside resources, which is an important aspect. The whole dynamic of mental health today in coping and dealing with trauma and traumatic events, whether it's 9/11 or, Hurricane Harvey or, fighting a war. There's the aftermath of post-traumatic stress disorder, and it needs to be addressed.
Right, which used to be called shell shock, and before that was not even really addressed at all, because it was not considered manly. To back up, because the counseling obviously is what you ended up getting into, and this is where you become super essential and I think integral cog in this post 9/11 reality that thousands of people had found themselves in that were either directly or tangentially connected to the events of that day. But I want to ask you a couple questions about how you kind of left things there. I specifically want to know about specifically your feelings about Tommy Kavekis. Knowing that he had perished, he was the last, I think, firefighter, or one of the last firefighters buried. That was right. He was buried in May of 2002.
They had a memorial from
a memorial because they didn't recover his body, and I remember that memorial. It was out in Nassau County. My specific memory of that was, as we've discussed, is the incredible silence that I have never heard in my life on the street after the bagpipes had played for him. And he also had a daughter that was a year older than me, and I remember talking to her briefly and that day, and she was going off to college, or she was in college, she had just started, and thinking that this could have very easily been me. And I guess that brings me into kind of the bigger question, which was, do you feel like, and I don't mean to put it crudely, but do you feel like you dodged a bullet? Do you feel like the blessing was in you getting hurt in the 90s? Because I assume that you would have been you would have been there. So do you ever think back on that situation?
Well, sometimes when you go through situations, when it's so fresh and you're so close to it, you really can't see it for what it really is. And I guess in hindsight, I could look back and reflect on it. Yeah, the last guys I worked with, one of the last men I worked with was Jack Fanning. And so, Jack, I had worked with him, on and off. He was in the engine for a while on Bradford Street, and then he got promoted to captain, and then he got promoted to battalion chief. And he was very involved with the rescue services, the hazmat, the USAR teams, urban search and rescue teams, which he wanted me to be part of. So I think back about it, and I go, okay, I wasn't meant to be there. When I was doing my graduate work, and I was going to, and I asked to be placed in the counseling unit in Lafayette Street, and I was denied, and I was really upset about it. But this was before 9/11, and I was upset that they said, no, you couldn't come. But, again, the time had passed, you look back, well, Lafayette Street was where a couple of the companies were housed below, and they all sadly perished on 9/11. So had I been there, and there was not only the people who died responding, they were active on-duty firefighters that day. There were people that came from the medical office. They came from all different things. They came from home, and they were not working. They were not assigned, but they showed up. There was a massive loss of life, and I don't know exactly what the numbers are for that. So, I wasn't supposed to be there. I had tried prior to that. I had tried to get back on the job again because my goal at that point was to go into the counseling unit to have to be a resource for firefighters, and it didn't work out that way. Ultimately, you know, fast forwarding into 2001, that the fire department ultimately hired me as a therapist after 9/11, and then I worked in their counseling unit for almost 15 years. But that's the way I was meant, you know, that's the way I was supposed to be of service, you know, is the way I reconcile it for myself.
So let's get into that then, because I think this is where, for as heroic as your deeds were, and for as much valor as you showed, and all of your friends and your buddies alive and deceased had shown that day and in the days and months afterwards, as you had gone back into the city, by the way, multiple times and helped with the recovery and all of that, I really feel like the essential nature of what you ended up doing was in the years, the literal years afterwards, because as you had said, you were in grad school at the time, you're a social worker now with your own practice, but for many years you had worked on behalf of the fire department in this counseling unit that you had mentioned to help those who were there, or families that were affected by the loss, or families that were affected by a person who has PTSD, or whatever the case might be. And this is where you really, in my mind, and in the family's mind, and in many people's minds that are connected to the 9/11 community, have taken on somewhat of a heroic status with people. I've said before in the past that, and we had just seen it in the bookstore when we were out in the Montauk, we had run into an old fire buddy of yours, and Dagan and I were reflecting on how, without fail, when we meet someone that you know that's connected to 9/11 in some way, that's connected to the firehouse, they always tell us, and this guy pulled us aside, this gentleman pulled us aside, and he's like, your dad's one of the greats. Because you spun this terrible thing into a way, like you said, to be of service and to help, and dedicated your life for 15 plus years, and still do it in your private practice now, helping these people cope. And the reason that they want to talk to you is because you were there. It's not like seeing a therapist and saying, you know, a guy comes back from Iraq and he sees a therapist, and the therapist's like, yeah, I understand what you mean, but you don't fucking have any idea what he's talking about, you know, actually, because he was in a war zone in Fallujah and you were in an office somewhere. You were there, and so they want to talk to you. They want to bend your ear and get some advice from you. So tell me about that experience, because this is really what your life has been all about since 9/11.
Well, it's been a very gratifying and humbling, and I have a lot of gratitude to be able to do that, to really walk with people through their respective challenges that they have, and you know, so many good, lovely people. You know, the people that were deeply affected by 9/11, the families, the wives, the families, the parents, siblings, and you know, and you extrapolate those figures, it's thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people who were ultimately affected by the loss. And so, you know, talking to, you know, having, you know, many of these people are dear friends, widows, and you know, who raised, you know, a widow who raises her 4 daughters, and you know, her youngest daughter is just starting college, so she was, you know, an infant when 9/11 happened. And you see that, you know, you see that, and you grow with them when you see a child who was, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 years old, and now they're 19, 20, 21, you know, and they're going on and they're living their lives, and their parents, their mothers, you know, a lot of the widows dedicated their lives to, you know, focusing on their children. The parents of firefighters who died, you know, very important, you know, that they're acknowledged, and how they try to commemorate their respectively their sons' memories, and how they were deeply affected by it, whether, you know, very involved and cared deeply for the Kiefer family, and how, you know, they lost their son Michael, who was a very vibrant firefighter, a young firefighter, and how they were deeply affected by it, and how they continue to have, you know, yearly fundraisers to support all the different causes in the memory of their son, and not only her, Margaret Cawley. There's just so many people who, I had a parents group, and when I started, it was a parents grief group, and there was 55 parents in there, you know, who lost their sons. And so really just, it was an honor and a privilege to be able to walk with those people and to help them manage their grief and their loss. And which is what I do today if I'm dealing with, you know, with a firefighter who is dealing with, you know, post-traumatic stress or depression or whatever is going on. It's really about walking with him. He's not, you know, they're not alone, and that has been, you know, that has been my practice. That is what I, you know, do and try to do for those people. So you know, of course, being in New York City, it's, you know, it's very real because we live it every day, and I think people from other parts of the country, they put a timeline on it 16 years later, but, you know, it's 16 years in, you know, you can chronicle it at 16 years, but for many people, it's like, it's a year. It just happened.
Yeah, just yesterday.
You know, because that loss is a loss. They have to adjust, you know, they have to adjust living their lives with the loss, whether it's the loss of a husband. Teresa Jamona is doing a thing for you New York people who know about Coney Island and the roller coasters. Vinny Jamona died on his birthday, on 9/11. He was killed on his birthday. 2 days before, they were at Coney Island, and they were getting ready to leave, and he said to his wife, "I'm going to ride the roller coaster." So he went, and just by himself, he paid the person money, and he went up and he rode the roller coaster. And that was the last thing that Vinny did, because that, you know, that was it may have been a Sunday, because that Tuesday he perished. And so September 9th, they're doing something, they're calling it Ride Like Vinny Day at Coney Island as we speak. And so if you guys, whoever is around close to Coney Island, go there, go have fun, ride the roller coaster. It supports a lot of good causes, one of them being the widows and orphans of the firefighters and police officers who were slain. So people are involved in doing all these things. John Viggiano lost 2 of his sons. Gary Sinise is very involved with his foundation to build smart homes for veterans. So Friday, John had what we call a racket, a fundraiser to support Gary Sinise and his foundation in doing good things for veterans. John Viggiano was very involved with the veterans, which was synonymous with, there was a connection between the veterans and 9/11 after 9/11. So there are a lot of people who still to this day are doing, you know, very altruistic things to try to help, you know.
And I feel like that's what you've done as well, because I know we always talk about your humility, and as you told your story, you can see the humility as you kind of remove yourself from the situation, and I respect that about you. But I think someone, and I'm sure that people have told you in the past, that you deserve a great deal of credit for dedicating your life to this particular thing. You could have done many different things with your life, and obviously this is your calling. You are a fireman at heart, it's a serendipitous, although a terribly serendipitous way for a sort of continuity in your career to stay with the FDNY and to have done that for so long, which I think is fantastic and such an amazing thing. And the reason that I wanted to talk to you was because, you know, I think the provenance of this particular story is important. I think that, you know, we're both really big Band of Brothers fans. We watched that together when it came out, you know, 15, 16 years ago now. And one of the coolest things about that show is them talking to the veterans that played Winters or played whoever, and they kind of introduce every episode with the real people that did that. And you think back about those times, D-Day, the invasion of Europe, for instance, in 44 and 45, and those people are gone. Their stories are gone. And if you didn't get them to tell some of those stories, then there might be some regret. And I feel like it's important for me, and I want to start with you, but hopefully end up doing this with you again and getting deeper into it and doing it with maybe other people. It's getting these stories out there so that in 100 years, if YouTube still exists and a grad student somewhere is doing his graduate degree on first responders at 9/11, or he's doing a dissertation, that this story exists. So these stories have been circulating around the Moriarty clan for a long time, and some of them haven't, some of them I had never heard. But I thank you for taking the time to talk to me about it. I know it's not easy. I see it in your eye, and I know that I've seen you at your worst, and I've seen you at vulnerable states, and I just have a lot of respect for you. You're a man, like a hero and stuff, and we, it's a great honor to be your son.
Well,
I guess is what I'm saying.
Thank you, and thank you for this time. I would, that hero is, I'm not a hero. I'm doing what, like everybody else would do, is the mindset in the fire department and with the brothers and in the world of men and so forth is you do the right thing. And that's it. There's no variable. You just do the right thing. And so, and you show up, and that's what we do. And that's what everybody does. And, in that, from a cultural perspective. So it's, it's an honor and a privilege. It's what I do. It's the path I could take because I love being a firefighter. And when I no longer could do that, and I would say to people that, well, you know what, I'm not kicking indoors anymore, but this is how I'm doing it, and because it keeps me connected to that, to that passion, that what I love to do, and so and that's why I continue to do it.
Well, I thank you for sharing the story, Dad. I definitely want to do this again with you, and maybe we can talk about some different angles about it, because it is a fascinating journey from Air Force to iron worker and doing some odds and ends. Actually owned a produce store for a while, became a firefighter, retired due to injury, goes back to school, finds his way back to where he belongs. And I think it's a great story and an uplifting story. And for a man who has experienced as much loss as you have, which I think is the understated thing about you, a thing that maybe in our family we don't talk enough about. It's a dark joke, and I don't mean it to be funny, but I've made it to you in the past where I talk to you, I call you once a week, once every other week, whatever it is. You often say, and I don't even think I'm being dramatic, often, I just came back from a wake. I just came back from a funeral. This is a regular occurrence with you, as the people that you've known, the people whose lives you've touched, slowly leave us on this particular coil, as it were. And I think that shows an immense amount of strength. You are a strong man physically, but clearly a mentally strong man as well, because of the amount of people and the amount of just loss that's churned through your life. And I think that you've done it stoically, and you deserve an immense amount of respect for what you did. And I see it. I think it fills me with a lot of pride to be a Moriarty, to be the son of Gerard Moriarty, who's, again, and you'll never admit it because I know who you are, a player that has helped a lot of people over the years, who I've personally met, who I've heard their stories as well. And every Thursday night, what would you do for years? You'd go to your parents' group, right? No matter what happened, from when I was still a senior in high school until just a few years ago. Parents' group every Thursday, no matter what. You would dedicate your day and your time and volunteer your time. After working a full 10-hour day, you'd go to, and take care of that kind of stuff. I've seen you take phone calls at all hours of the night from people that need you, that are in distress. I've seen you be pulled aside to listen to a voicemail. I've seen you drop everything to go speak to someone or go see someone. I've seen you do everything. And it might not have been obvious that I observed those things, but as a younger man, but and when I come home from college and stuff like that, but I observed it. And I know that it kept going. So thank you. Appreciate you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this time, and to say it's been it continues to be my privilege.
Right on. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this very special episode of Colin's Last Stand. I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you again to Dave Rubin, David Janet, and Amira as well for taking time out to let me do this in their studio. They have obviously lots of things to do with their own company and their own lives, so that's not lost on me either. I owe you guys one. And I hope you enjoyed the episode. So that's it. I'm not going to leave you with any spiel other than that. Other than I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Keep on learning.